Howdy everyone, you're listening to Blue Jeans and Boots, where genetics grad students talk about how to navigate a PhD program while trying to stay sane. We also often invite faculty from our interdisciplinary program here at Texas A&M and pick their brains about their research, what it's like being a principal investigator, and their journey to becoming a professor here at A&M, or in special cases like today's episode at places other than A&M. In this episode, we'll talk to Dr. R. Graham Reynolds, a professor of biology at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Duke University and his PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research focuses on the genetics and conservation of reptiles and amphibians in the southeastern United States and the Caribbean. My name is Veronika, and I'll be your host today. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Veronika.
So we're going to dive right into it. So can you please tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to work in sort of what I call the tripod of research. And so that includes field work, that includes sort of traditional lab or bench work, and computational work. And what I like about that is that it always keeps things interesting, right? So I take those three things and I apply them to situations and species that I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of ways that has been recently focused on Caribbean reptiles, and in particular focused on endangered species. And so I've worked on iguanas and anolis lizards and boas in particular, which is what I'm going to be talking about in my seminar today. And that's a lot of fun. And, you know, there are some surprising things that come from that. And one of the things that has happened is that I've kind of become known as the person who visits islands that are very remote, where there's no one else, and go and record what species are present on those islands. But in particular, I'm the one that stays overnight and looks at night. And so I've got some great stories about what can happen on these islands in terms of what you might discover when you stay overnight on remote islands. And so that's been a really fun part of the work that I've done recently.
That's amazing. Yeah. So what would you say is the hardest part then when you do visit the islands and you stay there overnight? Like, what is the hardest part about it?
That's a great question. The hardest part, I mean, for obvious reasons, nobody's done this before on a lot of these islands, and there's a reason for that.
It's risky.
It's risky, and it's challenging. And yeah, I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of planning, right? So we have to bring our own water and power and all that kind of stuff, food, obviously. And we have to make safety precautions and everything. So it's helped that I have sort of an outdoors background, because that makes me just feel more comfortable being in the wilderness. But you have to remind yourself to be very, very careful. So whereas you would normally say walk at a certain speed, or maybe be a little more risky in terms of where you might go, you have to be intentional about being very careful, right? Thinking about the steps that you take and where you put your feet, because if you slip, it's a little bit harder to deal with that when you're that far and remote from anything else, and especially at night.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Yeah. So are these islands that you're talking about mostly uninhabited, or do they have people that live on these islands?
Yeah, most of the ones, especially the ones that I focus on, are uninhabited. And that's what I like. I like to go to these places where maybe herpetologists have been before, but again, nobody stayed overnight, and so maybe they don't know all the species that are there. And I have some pretty dramatic stories about that.
Please share at least one with us.
Okay, well, all right.
Please.
So I'll tell you this one. So, I mean, the classic one is the story of the discovery of the silver boa.
Yeah.
Right, and so I'm going to talk about that today in my seminar, but I might as well tell you podcast listeners about it. So I was part of a project. We were visiting islands all over the Caribbean while I was a postdoc at Harvard. And so we had funding to go and collect lizards, this type of lizard called the brown anole, from all these different islands. And it was an amazing project. It was a whole year of going to all these incredible places like the Cayman Islands and, the Bahamas and everywhere. So we were going throughout the Bahamas, and there's this island called Conception Island. It's a national park, but it's completely uninhabited, remote, and there's no park rangers or wardens or anything like that. So we knew we wanted to go collect lizards there. So we managed to charter a boat to get us out there, and I was with a team of other grad students, and I was the postdoc leading the team. And so we get out there, we catch our lizards, and we're looking around, and we're saying, man, this island, the forest looks really nice here, We really ought to stay and look around some more. So we convinced the boat captain to let us stay overnight. That wasn't part of the plan, so it took a little convincing, but sure enough, as the sun started to set, we get a call on the radio from one of the grad students, hey, I've got a snake over here. And there weren't supposed to be snakes on this island.
Really?
Yeah. So we come running over there. The sun is already set. It's dark now. And sure enough, there is a boa sitting in a silver palm. And it's unlike any other boa that we've seen before. It itself is bright silver. And so we knew immediately that we had found something special. So we set about off into the woods. The next few hours throughout the night, we found 5 more boas that night. And so, I mean, we were just giddy with excitement.
That's amazing.
So we decide to lay down on the beach. We're going to sleep for maybe an hour or two until the boat comes at dawn. Right? So we just lay out in the sand and try to take a nap. It's the middle of the night. Fall immediately asleep. And then I wake up maybe 30 minutes later because there's something on my face. And you know that groggy feeling when you're waking up. And it's so I reached up, and it's something big. And so I grabbed it with my hand and lifted it, and it was a snake.
It was a snake?
Yeah, it was a boa.
On your face?
On my face. So it had crawled down from the forest across the beach and on top of my head. And so, I don't know, what would you do if you were in that situation?
Like, realistically, I think I would just get up and run maybe for a mile. That's probably what I would do.
Woken up from a dead sleep with a big snake on your face? Yeah. I think most people would.
What did you do?
Well, I just put it in a bag and went back to sleep.
Okay. So when y'all saw the snakes earlier that night in the forest, did you just like observe them and took pictures and left them there, or did you like bring them with you on the beach and then you would like look at them properly?
Yeah, so for each one we caught, we processed it, right? So we took measurements, counted scales, photographs, of course, and DNA samples. And so we had all of those data for each one. So when I put that snake in the bag, I had to get up then and wake everybody else up before the boat came. Said we have one more snake to finish before we leave. And of course, we're scientists, right? So at the time we're thinking, okay, this is something we've never seen before. But we weren't so ready to say this is a new species, right? Because you just want to...
You want to make sure.
Yeah, let's make sure. Well, sure enough, we get back to the lab, sequence the DNA, all the measurements. We compare it because we had already had a database of all the other boas in the Caribbean. And immediately it's clear that this is a brand new species.
So what would you say makes this boa special?
Oh my gosh, everything about it. They're beautiful. They're a different color than any other boa. They are silver colored. So
what is the normal
striking.
color of a boa?
I mean, normally they're more of a grayish or a brownish color. Many of the other species in the Caribbean, but these are bright silver. And so we named it Argentum, which is a Latin word for silver. It just is.
That's lovely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so they're just amazing. They're also, it turns out, the most endangered boa on the planet.
Really?
By far. So we've done a total of 4 expeditions to the island, and we estimate that there are 120 boas total for the whole species, and that they are found in an area less than 5 hectares. So this is a concerning situation from a conservation standpoint. We've assessed them as being critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, and we're quite concerned about them and what their future is. Furthermore, we've been sequencing their DNA, and we found that they have an order of magnitude less diversity across the whole species than most of the other really famous endangered species like black-footed ferrets. And so how they are still existing is a mystery. And we're hoping to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. So are they endemic to this island?
They are.
They are?
They're found nowhere else. We have not seen them or heard of them anywhere else. And again, it's only 5 hectares of forest that they're found in.
So even the islands that would be the closest to that island, did you go and look?
Yep.
Yeah.
We looked on all those islands. What's interesting about Conception Island is it's surrounded by water that's thousands of feet deep. So this island has never been connected to another island. So anything that got there in terms of terrestrial
Had
wildlife
to like float or
had to
something.
float there. Yeah. And so the other islands nearby, which really they're not that close, we have searched there, and some of them have had people for hundreds of years, and there's never been reports of snakes on those islands. So we know that they're isolated on this one.
And this island doesn't have any people, right?
No people.
No
Nope.
people.
Nope. There's some interesting historical things. There was a shipwreck, a double shipwreck that happened on the island in the 19th century, and 300 sailors got stranded on this island.
That's scary.
Yeah, they were there for a few weeks, and they recorded everything that happened. They ate, I think it was 10,000 queen conch while they were there.
What is that?
The queen conchs are these, there's these large marine gastropods that are actually delicious. But they just, you think about like the impact that 300 humans can have on a fragile island ecosystem just in a few weeks. I mean, the fact that they ate thousands of just one species of conch. Like, what else did they do? So yeah, that's something interesting to think about, that even if nobody has lived there, humans have impacted that island.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the story
Sure,
that you
there you
shared
go,
with us. Maybe diverging back to like
Yep.
academia and
Yep.
graduate school. So what was your graduate school experience like?
Yeah, I had a great experience, a great lab, a great PI, and a great department. And so I feel like I got excellent training, and I was able to learn the skills that I needed and had not yet learned. I was able to get better at those things. And I was telling some grad students at lunch today, you know, when you think about academia, maybe a way to think about it is adding tools to your toolbox, right? And so learning different techniques, learning the ability to feel comfortable, maybe not mastering, but at least being good at using different types of techniques can really help depending on where you want to go in the field. And so I learned population genetics, I learned coding, I learned all that kind of stuff, mathematics, and had great support in that. But then I also really just liked doing the natural history stuff. So my best friend in grad school, Matt Niemiller, and I decided, we hatched a plan to go and write a field guide to the reptiles and amphibians of Tennessee in graduate school, because I was at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And we approached my advisor about it. And you know, what would you do if you were a PI and your grad students said they wanted to come and just write a book instead of doing their dissertations, right? You'd probably say no. And to his credit, he said, okay, but it can't get in the way of your dissertations. We said, okay, that's a fair deal. But he allowed us to do it. And it was one of the coolest experiences, because we got to go all over the state photographing reptiles and amphibians, and it turned into 2 books.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So what would be any of the challenges that you think that you got to grad school, you were there for a couple years. What challenges did you face?
You know, grad school is a series of ups and downs, as you all know. For me, the first year was tough. You know, I found myself very much feeling like I had imposter syndrome, you know, and it felt at the time like I just didn't belong, right? That it was just going to be too hard. There was too much to learn. Everybody was smarter than me. Those feelings that we've all had. And so I think the most important lesson I learned was that everybody feels that way, even PIs, even full professors. And so if you can understand that and acknowledge the existence of that feeling, then maybe you don't let it consume you. And you say, yeah, sure, there's always going to be somebody that's smarter than me. But it doesn't mean I can't learn, and it doesn't mean I can't get good at this. And oh, by the way, that person is feeling like there's always somebody smarter than them, right? And it's just this thing that's common in academia. And so it's important for grad students to understand how pervasive that is and to acknowledge its existence so that you don't let it get in your way. Because you are smart enough and you do belong here. That's why you're here.
Yes.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students that are considering going to graduate school who are now in undergrad?
Yeah. So, you know, graduate school is a great path, but it's not for everybody, right? And so I think you have to think about what it is that you would like to do. You have this amazing opportunity as an undergraduate. You know, you're getting a degree. You could do anything. And so if it is the case that you enjoy learning new things, that you enjoy the process of science, then perhaps grad school is a good chance for you to get to practice that. And, you know, too often we think that grad school, especially going into PhD, is a direct line into academia. Okay, and yeah, that is the case sometimes. But you can take a master's degree or PhD and go on and do any number of things. And we have a great need for folks who are trained at those levels to go into different fields and to bring that expertise to those fields as well. So academia for me has always been the dream, and I absolutely love it. But that should not be the only path that you consider as part of your grad school experience, because there's lots of others.
Yeah, so you just touched upon that you always wanted to do academia. So
Yeah.
what, or even when, did you get this motivation to go into academia and become a wonderful professor?
All right, Veronika. So I'm going to admit I'm a little unusual. Okay, so I decided in the 9th grade, high school, that I was going to be a biology professor. And
you decided when you were in 9th grade that you're going to be a biology professor.
Yeah, I did. That was what my dream became at that moment. And I'll tell you, and this is another story I'll tell in my seminar today, but what happened is I read 2 books. I had a teacher in high school, a biology teacher in my freshman biology class. She handed me one of the books, Hen's Teeth and Horse's Toes by Stephen Jay Gould, who's a famous paleontologist at Harvard. And then the other book I grabbed was Candide by Voltaire. And I read those 2 books that first year, and something happened in my brain. It feels like, looking back, it's like fireworks kind of thing. And I feel like there was an opportunity to do the kinds of things that Stephen Jay Gould was writing about, to figure out those amazing discoveries about the natural world, and then to be part of this exciting, dynamic, academic experience, like academia, like learning things and teaching things. And then the Voltaire thing comes along because, hopefully some of your listeners read Candide. It's a great book. Voltaire was an iconoclast. He was a interesting writer. But the story Candide, there's a character in there named Dr. Pangloss. And Dr. Pangloss feels like, he's a philosopher, he feels like, this is the best of all possible worlds, right? He's very much an optimist. And the character is being made fun of in that book, in the sense, because it's a social commentary, that whole book is. But for me, I said, well, this is pretty great, right? And if you marry those 2 concepts of doing science and feeling like what an exciting time to be a scientist, then you really feel like there's some things that you can do that will be fun. And for me, that's what happened at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you were in that 9th grade and you knew you were going to be a biology professor, was amphibians and reptiles also something on the list that you considered doing in the future? Yeah,
not necessarily. I wasn't sure what it was going to be at that point. I was really into fish and sharks. So I thought it was going to be marine science. And in fact, I applied to university to do marine science. And I ended up before I got to college, I went and did an internship in Mexico. And I assisted on a project where we were trapping carnivores in the tropical dry forest. So ocelots, coatis, pygmy skunks, all these kinds of things. And it was that experience that really told me that I wanted to be a tropical biologist. Mm-hmm. And then I got to college and was, fully going to do marine science. And I was in a animal behavior class, like you were talking about yours. And we had to write a grant proposal for that class. And so I wrote a grant to study poison dart frogs on islands off of Panama. And I asked my professor, I said, can I submit this grant and try to get some funding? And she said, sure, why not? I think she thought, okay.
Yeah, she's like, okay, go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, we got funding. And so
well, good for you.
Yeah, I know. And she's like, yeah, go on. And so I went to Panama and I did this project on poison dart frogs. And for me, that was the time at which I said, okay, it's not just tropical biology, but it's islands, and it's probably reptiles and amphibians. Mm-hmm. And so it's, this career path kind of builds. It's not necessarily the case that you just find what it is right off the bat, but it builds. Right? So then I get to graduate school and I say, okay, I'm going to work on islands, reptiles and amphibians. I was going to work on rattlesnakes in the Gulf of California. And my advisor was like, by yourself? Maybe that's not a good idea, right? Like, it's dangerous. So that was probably good advice. But anyway, we kind of spun the globe.
You do that anyways now, so.
Well, yeah, I do.
Yeah, so nothing changed.
Nothing changed. True. But yeah, I spun the globe, and so I picked the Turks and Caicos Islands, and I've been working there for 20 years, and I found that there were boas there, and nobody knew anything about these boas. And so I said, well, that doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. So then I started studying the boas, and the rest is history. So,
wonderful.
Yeah.
So now that you have your own lab, you lead your own research, what would a typical day for you look like?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's even more complicated because now I'm an administrator. I run our honors program. So in a typical day, it could be any number of things. It's a lot of administrative stuff. But what I love is I make sure to have time to advise students. I love those individual student meetings. That's the whole reason I'm at this university that I'm at, where we have, a focus on student learning, is there's a real opportunity to shape young people's lives by just listening to them and answering those questions. I mean, so many of our students, like, maybe they never thought that they could actually be a scientist or what that looks like. And so we have those conversations, or, what does it take to get into vet school? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so just having the chance to connect with students and to give them advice and to point them where they need to go in terms of resources, that's really my day-to-day, a lot of it. And it's a really rewarding part of the job.
So is this something that motivated you then to switch from a pretty big school into a smaller liberal arts university in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, yeah, I was at Harvard, and I had more time. I could have stayed there longer than I did. And I loved it, don't get me wrong, and I'm still affiliated with Harvard. I just love it there. But I really did miss working directly with undergraduates because I think that's such a formative time. And for me especially, getting to do undergraduate research was one of the best things I could have done. And so I like being at a university where we can focus on teaching and on mentoring undergraduate research, because I think those kinds of places are important in addition to larger universities in terms of providing all different kinds of students that then feed into academia. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's, I don't know, I find it really rewarding, and I would rather do that than just have my head down writing grants all day.
Yeah.
I'd rather work with students. So yeah, that's what I love about it.
What kind of challenges do you think come with being at a smaller, only undergrad university if you're running a lab like you do?
There's a lot of challenges. I think you have to remember that there's a lot of teaching. So you got to really like teaching. I teach 4 classes every semester.
That's a lot.
Yeah. so yeah, you have to lean into being good at teaching and embrace it and understand that it really is a big part of your job at a school like that. We are primarily evaluated on our teaching. And so, if it's just not something that you enjoy or not good at, then that's not the right fit. But it is challenging. You have to be creative because we don't have graduate students. So we have to get undergraduates trained up pretty fast in order to start performing at the level of grad students. Yeah. I mean, they really do. By the time you're a senior in a lot of our labs, like you're already functioning like a grad student in terms of your independence. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know that. And so then also being creative with getting funding. Mm-hmm. We are not often traditionally funded in terms of large ongoing NSF grants. We do have those, and we get those. But we're also creative in terms of finding smaller pots of money that can support undergraduates specifically. And so, yeah, I think being flexible, being creative, and finding ways to have undergraduates doing work that's publishable, is important too, because you can maintain your productivity. So, yeah.
How big is your lab? Like, do you have any postdocs by any chance? Because when I was at UNC Asheville, I was part of a lab that did, in fact, have like a postdoc to kind of help out with undergrads and train them in some ways. So does your lab also run that way?
Yeah, my lab, we don't have postdocs, but our department occasionally does. I'm a little hesitant to take postdocs sometimes because when I was a postdoc, I really benefited from having a postdoctoral culture. Mm-hmm. Other postdocs around who could kind of support each other and that kind of thing. We had a wonderful culture like that at Harvard. It was great. But because there's so few at UNC Asheville, you really have to find somebody who is intrinsically motivated, able to operate without that kind of support. And so, and plus you want to be able to mentor them in the way that postdocs need and deserve to be mentored. So I have sort of felt like if it's the right person, then absolutely, but it's not a focus.
So it depends more on the fit of the person, if you think others would benefit from it as well. Yeah. And then the postdoc as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it's a two-way street, right? I mean, as a postdoc, you need to make sure that you're getting that mentoring that's going to help you get to the next level, because I always tell people a postdoc is one of the greatest jobs. Right, because you're getting paid to do science, and it's just fantastic. But it's simultaneously one of the hardest jobs because it's a temporary job. As soon as you start your postdoc, oftentimes you're thinking about, okay, what has to come next? Yeah. So I'm going to start applying for jobs now. And so you have to find that balance, and you need you don't always need it, but it can be helpful to have a mentor who can help support that. And those feelings of, okay, there was a perfect job that I applied for, a faculty job, and I didn't even get an interview, what's going on? And you need somebody who can help you think about the strategy behind what that looks like. So there's a mentoring component to postdoc that is important, and it's sometimes it's not there, and that's unfortunate. It needs to be there.
Yeah. How many students do you usually have in your lab?
In my lab, so when I'm not an administrator, I usually have between 4 and 6. Right now I have 2, but that's because I'm only I'm half time administering, so it's a little tougher. But I've had some amazing students come through the lab. Many of them have gone straight to PhD or to vet school, and it's really been fun.
Are you still in touch with your students?
Almost all of them, yeah. They email me all the time. I come give seminars at their universities. It's just like, it's an amazing thing. It's really special.
So earlier you mentioned that you teach 4 courses. One of them is called The Biology of Star Wars, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Can you please tell us about it?
This is a really fun class, the biology of Star Wars. I mean, the idea behind this is that there has to be a better way to get non-scientists excited about biology. Students who think that they don't enjoy science or enjoy biology because they're picturing having to memorize the Krebs cycle, maybe having them memorize the Krebs cycle is not the best way to have them take an introductory biology class if they're not biology majors. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there has to be a better way to teach core concepts in creative ways. And so that was the idea behind this. And what I wanted to do was to take concepts from evolutionary biology, in particular, these ideas that I'll talk about in the seminar today, but determinism, okay, the sort of the natural selection idea that maybe parts of evolution are predictable, but also contingency, right? And so traditionally, there was this argument between Stephen Jay Gould and Simon Conway Morris in particular about what were the relative influences of either contingency in the evolutionary process or determinism, right? So, these ideas have largely sort of folded in together to the understanding that both ideas are important. But what I want to do is have students explore these ideas by thinking about, well, what about life on other planets, right? So let's take the Star Wars creators at their word and watch a Star Wars movie and make a field guide to the wildlife that's in the movie, right? And so identify the creatures, what do they do? Think about their ecology, their anatomy, right? Those kinds of things. And then we start to analyze okay, well, what's the probability that this kind of flora or fauna would evolve in this scenario? And is that because things that look like animals that we're familiar with are inevitable? In other words, is there this sort of deterministic outcome? Or is it the case that maybe you think the Star Wars creators aren't creative enough and that they should have come up with characters that are totally unfamiliar, right? And that would be more the contingency argument. So that turns out to be a very good premise to get students to think about evolution, and without even realizing it, they learn the 4 evolutionary mechanisms: natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift. And so I think it works well. And it's a lot of fun.
It's impressive and very creative.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I should export that idea, I think, but yeah, it's good.
I think it's amazing. You haven't been teaching this for too long, right?
No, only two times now. Yeah.
Because I remember walking in the hallway and I saw a poster about that class.
Yep.
And I was very skeptical
Yep.
because I didn't know what I would expect. I was already a junior, senior at the time, and it's an introductory class, right?
It is,
for
yeah. Sure is.
non-science majors, right?
That's the idea.
But when I saw that title, I was intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting some traction. I got invited to a Comic-Con
Really?
to talk about biology of Star Wars, and that was fun. It turns out that a lot of people know a lot more about Star Wars than I do. So I was kind of schooled in terms of my knowledge of Star Wars. But yeah, it's a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, I try to think about what is it that's potentially viewed as boring about science? And let's just realize that it doesn't have to be that way, because it's not boring.
It's not.
Yeah. And so I think it's more about how we teach it.
I like that thought. Yeah. Because I feel like there's been some times when I was excited about a specific concept, but the way it was then projected to me, if there is a lack of passion or something around that, I just feel like it's harder for me to even try to understand it from the first second. So if I don't get it right at the first time I'm hearing about it, it's just not really going to build up then. So I feel like the passion is very important in this case.
I think it's tremendously important. Yeah, getting students excited and understanding that all of these observations, all of these creatures, all of these ideas can be very exciting.
Yeah.
And should be.
Yes. So outside of academia and universities and trips, what are your hobbies?
Yeah.
What do you like to do in your free time?
Yeah, well, I love traveling. I love traveling to look for wildlife, to photograph, to then use in my lectures. I love having firsthand stories of the animals that I talk about, say, in sophomore zoology. So that's one of my favorite things to do. I love hiking, scuba diving, snorkeling in mountain rivers, all of that kind of stuff. I love reading books. I like writing books. That's been a big fun
You wrote
thing
a book, right?
Yeah, I have 2 books that I'm writing currently. These are my 4th and 5th. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It can be really frustrating sometimes, but yeah, it's also fun because it gives you a chance to really explore ideas in a different way than sort of the typical scientific paper.
What kind of advice would you give to people who would potentially want to write a book?
Yeah. I would say make sure you really want to do it.
The motivation?
Yeah, because it's a lot of work. And, too often I think that, especially in an academic track, we get told not to write books, at least early on. Like, I've heard that over and over again, that before, when you're pre-tenure, you should not write a book because it's a waste of time.
But you've done it.
Yeah, several. So, I disagree with that advice because I think it can be a great way to really fill in gaps in knowledge. And it's also a lot of fun. And the whole process is fun. There's some tedium to it. And, I get the argument that occasionally perhaps writing a book is not as important as, say, writing a paper for Science or Nature or something like that. But the reality is I just enjoy it more. Yeah. So, you know what? I'm going to do that.
So what do you hope will be the long-term impact of your research, and what goals do you have for the future?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think, as scientists, we always think that our research is bigger than us and will outlast us. I think I just want to get people excited about stuff, right? So like in the classroom, if I can get students excited about flatworms, like that's a good day. If I can write a book that gets students excited about, or people excited about boas, like that's what the goal is, right? So yeah, I don't know. I guess I have so much passion and excitement about this stuff. I just want to share it, and I want to see other people embrace it. So I think that's the goal.
And I think it works.
Well, I hope so.
He's talking about a situation from a class that I took from him.
Yep.
And he talked about flatworms and how exciting they are and how colorful and undescribed they are. So the first time I heard him talk about just the species that I've never heard about and all sorts of opportunities that can come with studying such a small species in this big world, I got really passionate about science as well because I saw this person be passionate about something that's not really studied. So I was like, you can do anything.
Yeah.
If you can study flatworms, you can do anything.
You bet. Yeah.
Because you kept saying, go and do a PhD in flatworms.
Yeah. Nobody's taken me up on that yet. But
no.
Yeah, in the zoology class, I have students on the very last page of their notes. I always make sure that they have a dissertation ideas section.
Nobody ever said flatworms?
Not yet. Not yet. Somebody will.
I hope so.
Me too.
Okay. So is there a particular project or area of research that you're especially excited about right now?
Yeah, actually, 2 things. And one of them has to do with boas. Imagine that. But I'm currently putting the finishing touches on a book, Boas of the World. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a book about all the species of boas. There's 66 of them. And that, for me, has really identified where the holes in our knowledge are. So now I would really love to go and try to work on some of these other boas that are understudied. And so I've been over to Indonesia a few times. I was in New Guinea recently, trying to lay the groundwork for hopefully working on some of those. So that's something I'm excited about. The other thing I'm excited about, and this is the other book, is what happens in very small populations in terms of genetic diversity, right? So there are plenty of books about conservation genetics. But what I'm interested in is when populations get very small, sort of the classic population bottleneck, the expectation is that we have a genetic bottleneck as well. There's plenty of theory. There's plenty of examples of what happens, right? What I want to do is write a book about that time point when the populations get small, because this was something I studied for my dissertation too. And in particular, I was looking at what happens when populations bottleneck and then recover, right? Oftentimes that signature of a genetic bottleneck is actually lost, and you can't recover it using a lot of the methods that are available. The other thing is this idea of inbreeding and inbreeding depression, which are 2 very different things, which are often confused and used interchangeably, which is unfortunate because it's not the same thing. And this idea that inbreeding depression leads directly to extinction of species. And so you can pick up any conservation genetics textbook, you can read papers about conservation genetics, and that is sort of the implication of almost all of this work on endangered species, is that when populations get small, allele effects take over, inbreeding depression increases, fitness and survival go down, right? And so that should then inevitably lead to the extinction of the species. And that all seems reasonable, and it's supported by some models and some experimentation. But the reality is, we've never witnessed a species go extinct because of inbreeding depression specifically. And so my argument is that if we are going to accept that dogmatically, then we need to have the evidence to back it up, right? So I'm sort of issuing a challenge to conservation genetics researchers, to like my fellow scientists, that if we're going to continue to say this in such a direct way without any sort of caveat, that we need the evidence to support it. So this next book is going to be it's going to be more of a textbook user, how do we do conservation genetics, especially in very small populations. But there's going to be a theme underlying that perhaps the things that we've been saying so directly since the 80s need a little bit more support. And I think that's going to be a call to action, I hope. Yeah. And I hope it's not, it's going to be controversial, but hopefully not too much.
Yeah. So now that you already experienced so many different things, is there something that you haven't done yet and you wish to do it?
Something I haven't done yet.
Because you've done a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's plenty of places I'd still like to go. Mm-hmm. Plenty of creatures I would still like to see. Plenty of books that I would still like to write. I'm going to tell you that. Okay, I'll pick this. I'll pick another book, even though I've talked a lot about it. I really want to write a biography.
Do you?
Yeah.
Cool.
Of a scientist who has contributed a lot to the field, but whose work has never been summarized. And so I think that's going to be a project that I'm going to do here in a little bit once I finish these others. Mm-hmm. And I think, for me, that's going to be a challenge, right? Like writing a biography is very different than writing about boas or writing,
like a field
papers.
guide or something.
It's a very different kind of writing, so I think it's going to be a personal challenge. But I really love reading biographies, and so I want to see if I can do it.
Okay.
So we'll try that.
We'll catch up in a couple of years and see.
We may fail miserably, but we're going to try. So.
What advice would you give to grad students that just finished with their degree and are about to leave graduate school? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that it can be a really tumultuous time in the life of an academic, those transition periods. You can often feel the weight of rejection. We trade in rejection a lot in academia. Our papers get rejected, our grants get rejected. We don't get the jobs that we really think that we're perfect for. And that can be a tough thing to process. So maybe start by not calling it a rejection, right? We say reject this paper, blah, blah. Maybe let's not use that word so much. Because it's not a referendum on you as a scientist, right? This is just, it's the competitive nature of publishing, of grant writing, of academic jobs. And so it can be easy to get discouraged in those transition points when things just don't seem like they're working out in the moment. But you have to stay positive. It's Dr. Pangloss, right? Yeah. You have to be an optimist.
Yes.
And so you keep pushing, and you know that you're good enough, and you know that you've done the work to get to that point. You earned a PhD or a master's degree after all. They don't just hand those out, right? And so you have to believe in yourself and keep pushing and keep trying and reach out to those of us who have gotten past those points, because we're always willing to help, or at least we should be. So yeah, take advantage of that too.
Is there something you think, now reflecting back on your journey, that you would have done differently?
I think I wouldn't have been so hard on myself. And it's easy for me to say that now, right? But when I was applying to faculty jobs, I took it really hard when I didn't get interviews, when I would apply to a job that I thought was perfect for me. And I felt that it was a referendum on me, instead of understanding that there were potentially 200 other PhDs that applied to that job. And so I tell students this when they're working on, their NSF grants or whatever. It's like, it's really competitive. And so you can't take it personally. You just understand that you try to be strategic in terms of what it is you want to do, and that you keep pushing.
I think that's very important to remember.
Yeah.
Especially now that grants are getting more and more competitive and more students apply. It's important to know that so many people apply, so if you do not get it, you should not take it too harshly.
having been on those committees for reviewing NSF postdocs and reviewing NSF GRFPs, all of those proposals are good. So how do we choose among the good ones to award the funding to? It's a vote by committee. And I hate to say that because it sounds like really, but it's just, again, the idea for me saying that is just to emphasize the fact that it's not a referendum on you as an individual scientist. Sometimes it's the luck of the draw. And that's why the more times you try, the better chance you have of finding success. So you keep pushing. Don't get discouraged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very important to remember.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today with Blue Jeans and Boots.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Today's episode was hosted by Veronika and produced by Isabella Childers and Elise Bow. This podcast is brought to you by the Texas A&M University Graduate Program in Genetics and Genomics. If you have any questions about our program here at A&M, please feel free to email us at bluejeansandboots@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X at Genetics Podcast. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll tune in next time.